Cantrips. There's a lot of them, and they're probably among the trickiest spells to design in the game, given that they are unlimited by nature and largely function as the backbone of most spellcasters, especially at early levels. Anyway, my guilty pleasure is that I love me a good tier list, so in this video we are going to be tier ranking every cantrip in the 2024 Player's Handbook. So I'm going to try and not waste too much of your time. I'm going to lay out my criteria, we'll give a minor disclaimer, and then we're just going to get into it. So, criteria. I didn't want it to strictly be damage based, since then all the creative cantrips are just gonna sit at the bottom. Instead, I did my best to weigh the potential power that a spell might have, which can include things like damage, versatility, utility, creative options, as well as availability of the spell. So with that in mind, here are the tiers. S. These are cantrips that offer exceptional value in most situations, combining strong power, utility, and versatility. These cantrips can often feel as impactful as leveled spells, and can be seen as essential for many players. A tier. These cantrips are highly effective and often among the best choices for certain classes, though they might lack the universal appeal of S tier, but they're still powerful and frequently used in a wide variety of situations. B tier. These cantrips are dependable and effective in many cases, but don't quite have the flexibility or consistent impact of the higher tier spells. They're solid picks, but they're definitely not must-haves. C tier. These cantrips have narrow use cases or are just outclassed by other options. They can absolutely shine in specific scenarios, but might feel like dead weight in many others. And finally, F tier. These cantrips are often just considered weak or ineffective. They rarely offer enough benefit to justify picking over the stronger options, unless used for niche or some flavor reasons. So those are the tiers, so try and keep them in mind throughout the video. Also, yes, your list is almost certainly going to look different than mine, and that's completely fine. That's all part of the game. I'm genuinely curious to hear what your thoughts and perspectives are on this. Just remember what the description of each tier is. Just because something is in C doesn't mean that it's hot garbage. It might be excellent in very specific circumstances. This is also not intended to be a comparison from the 2014 version of the spells, as someone picking up the game for the first time now probably doesn't care what the old versions were, and anyone moving forward with only 2024 content isn't going to care either. And finally, in no way is this me telling you what is right or wrong for your character. Pick whatever you want. I really just enjoy these kinds of videos and thinking these things through out loud, so take from it whatever you will. We're going to go through the list alphabetically. It's also probably worth mentioning that bards, sorcerers, and wizards can now swap their cantrips out much more regularly, so they don't feel nearly as locked in, which is an excellent quality of life improvement. Starting with Acid Splash. It lures you in with the dream of this AoE burst, but the reality is that the 5-foot sphere is an extremely small radius. In the right situation, it can be pretty effective if there are a few enemies clumped up, or even if you're just getting 2. It's not awful. The damage here is on the low side, but again, it gets better if you are hitting more targets, and it does target a dexterity save, which also isn't ideal, but it does have a reasonable range of 60 feet. I'm going to put this one in B tier, maybe B- if I had it. Next up is Blade Ward, which looks very enticing as well. Conceptually, it's a variable AC increase of between 1 and 4, which is pretty sweet. But there's a few problems. It requires your action to cast, so you're devoting the bulk of your first turn of combat casting it, unless you happen to be able to set it up earlier, in which case, sure. But it also requires your concentration for up to a minute, meaning that you can't concentrate on any other spell that you might want to, and it might never actually proc if you're just never targeted by an attack roll. Presumably, you would likely only be casting this if you knew that you were in immediate danger or were adjacent to an enemy, but even in that scenario, disengaging and running is probably better than just hoping for a good roll on a d4. Also, since it just doesn't work on saving throws, you might drop it before it even matters anyway. I want to love Blade Ward. It seems like it has a lot of potential upside, and if you are able to precast it, then sure, maybe. But 9 times out of 10, I don't see the dream panning out. I'm putting it in C. I do also want to give a big thank you to all of my channel members, but especially those in my champion tier, Julian, Karel, and Finiki. It's with all of your help and support that gets me one step closer to making this all a sustainable thing. So if you're able to and would like to consider supporting the channel, click on the join button to see what some of the benefits you can get are. Thank you so much. Moving on to Chill Touch, which actually is a touch spell now. I know this isn't a comparative list, I broke my own rule. Anyway, ironically, it being a touch spell is now kind of what hurts it. Most sorcerers or wizards likely don't want to be in touch range, and those that do probably have better things to do with their melee weapons. The Rider effect of preventing healing for a round is alright, but seems better suited to a very specific out of combat scenario where you're trying to bluff someone into thinking that you're going to help them. But even that is just so niche. Chill Touch is going to be our first F tier spell. Dancing Lights. This one has the potential to be a very good spell. The biggest thing working against it is that it requires concentration, but that's going to be fine during exploration. During combat, it might not feel great, but if you can't see the enemy, then it's going to be pretty hard to hit them. The bigger thing is though, that dark vision is just not hard to come by anymore. It feels like basically everyone has it. The flexibility of being able to spread out the lights or combine them into something vaguely human-like is pretty fun. I'm gonna put Dancing Lights in C, maybe like C+. Next is Druidcraft, which is a fun and flavorful cantrip, but it's not really doing a whole lot for you. Yes, it can create some very nice moments during social encounters, but it's unlikely to be a spell that you're just dying to cast all the time. It's going in C. Eldritch Blast both was and still is an absolute banger spell. The scaling of this one being that it grants you an additional beam rather than just increased damage creates so much versatility. Yes, it is unique to Warlock, but it's just so good. And it can target objects now, so that's even better. Eldritch Blast has got to be our first S tier cantrip. Elementalism is another fun and flavorful spell. It's also kind of like Druidcraft, just not doing a whole lot for you most of the time, but it can be used to great effect in some very specific scenarios. So for that reason, I'm going to be putting it in C tier. Firebolt is a stable cantrip for wizards and sorcerers, combining excellent range with good damage, being able to target objects and catch things on fire. There's also just a lot of versatility here beyond strictly damage. This one is also going in S tier. Next up is Friends, which is another one that I want to love. It's exactly the kind of spell that the players in my game love to experiment with and try and get tons of mileage out of it. But it does have some issues. Concentration doesn't matter all that much since you're almost certainly casting it outside of combat. The bigger issue is that the charmed condition just doesn't do all that much for you. The charmed creature can't attack you, sure, but they might not have been hostile to you anyway. But also, it doesn't stop them from attacking your allies. But secondly, it only gives advantage on checks while interacting socially. It's a fun Trick the Guard spell. It's a cantrip, but it also requires you to be within 10 feet of them and flail your arms around due to its somatic component. If you're a sorcerer with Subtle Spell, this is probably a bit better, but overall, it's a very tough sell. I gotta put this one in F. Moving on to Guidance, which is still an excellent spell. There's always the dream case of you knowing that your ally is about to attempt like 10 athletics checks in a row or something. But in reality, Guidance costs no resources, so even just getting value out of one check is perfectly fine. If you know someone is about to attempt a big jump or pick a lock or intimidate a captive, this is a great spell to cast and can work in so many situations. Guidance is a high A tier, maybe verging on S tier spell. Light is a spell. I've rarely seen light actually be cast in game, but I think it does have its place. It creates brighter light and it lasts longer in comparison to dancing lights. Interestingly though, despite it not having concentration, you can still only have one instance of the light spell active at any given time. I want to put it in F tier, but I won't. I'm gonna keep it in C. Mage Hand is next, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, this is an S tier spell. There's just so much versatility offered by it. You can use it to try and trigger traps, to open chests, to act as a distraction, to pick things up, to open doors. This is one of those spells that I love when my players choose it, because I know that I'm going to see some very creative plays happening as a result of it. I love Mage Hand, and I don't think I know anyone that doesn't. Next up is Mending, and this is another one of those spells that does inspire creativity in a player and offers a wide variety of scenarios that it can be useful. I don't see this one being picked up quite often as some other spells, despite it being on the Bard, Cleric, Druid, Sorcerer, and Wizard lists, but I do think that it's a very good spell that can solve a lot of problems during gameplay. It's not changing the game, but it's solid. It feels right dropping this in B tier. Continuing on our train of creative spells that have very fun and useful out-of-combat cases, Message is another banger. There's so many situations where being able to nearly silently communicate with an ally can be absolutely clutch during play, and the fact that the recipient can even respond to the message is just the icing on the cake. I considered S tier, but given that it only does one thing, admittedly doing it extremely well, but as a result, I'm going to put it in A. Mind Sliver is a very cool spell that I'm happy to see included in the 2024 PHB. It has a reasonable range, but more importantly, it targets an intelligence saving throw, our only cantrip to do so. This is among the best saves to target in the game from the caster's perspective. On top of that, it has the rider of subtracting 1d4 from the next saving throw the target makes before the end of your next turn. This is great because it allows for a functional setup and allows for you to play with your team. If you know that an ally is going to be requiring a save, getting the subtraction on that roll can be amazing. It's like Bane, but with damage. Admittedly though, the damage roll is only a d6, but it's still likely to land given that it is targeting the intelligence save, and the rider effect is good in its own right. Mine Sliver is going in A. Minor Illusion is another fantastic spell that offers so much creativity to the player that's using it. So many of the best moments of play that I've experienced have come off the back of this spell, so I feel like that has to count for something, and since it's my list, it will. Creating sounds or images at a distance, or even better with the new Illusionist Wizard, Minor Illusion is a creativity machine. Whether it's creating distractions, trying to intimidate, throw off people, or any number of other things, you can probably make it work with a spell. This is an S tier cantrip. Next up is Poison Spray, which is our only strictly 1d12 cantrip, but that's about where the good stops. At 30 feet, the range isn't all that great, but the worst part is the fact that it deals poison damage. Now, caveat, in 2014, poison damage was by far the most resisted or immune type in the game. Like, it wasn't even close. Something like a third of the creatures in all of 2014 D&D were either immune and or resistant to it. So on average, that makes the spell potentially much less viable, despite having, in theory, the highest damage potential. But now again, we haven't seen the 2024 Monster Manual, so we will need to reserve judgment on that. For the time being though, I'm gonna put it into B tier. Next up is Prestidigitation, another spell that I love. It offers a lot more variety of things to do than something like Elementalism or Druidcraft, and is probably more generally useful than either of them too. Rarely will Prestidigitation feel truly dead. I just finished a nearly 4.5 year campaign with 20th level characters, and the bard in my group was still using it. I know it probably belongs in B tier, but my heavy bias towards it is just making me drop it in A. I love it. Produce Flame is another spell of the fire and light category. It's only available to druids, which does limit a lot of the options for it. The flexibility it offers by being able to convert the fire in your hand into a damage dealing projectile though, is pretty cool, but it is essentially just a worse Firebolt with extra steps at that point. It is worth noting that Firebolt is not available to druids though, unless they opt for something like Magic Initiate Wizard. The spell feels fine, it's good to have, but I'm not sure how often it'll be used as a damage dealer outside of maybe the first round of combat where you just happen to already have it in your hand, and even then, it's kind of a maybe. I'm gonna put this in B tier. Moving on to Ray of Frost, this is just a solid option for wizards and sorcerers. 1d8 damage is admittedly not the best, but the 60-foot range is reasonable, especially when combined with the rider effect to slow an enemy's movement by 10 feet. If my World Tree Barbarian that I built a few weeks ago had a wizard using this, it would make them even better. Ray of Frost is just a good spell overall with some very nice upside. I'm putting this in A tier. Moving on to Resistance, this was made to be easier to use than it was in 2014, but it's still a very tough sell. It requires concentration, it requires you to touch the target, you get to select only one damage type, it only reduces damage by 1d4, and you can only benefit from it once per turn while you're maintaining concentration on it. You're better off using Blade Ward and hoping you just don't get hit in the first place. There's gonna be some super niche case where this is amazing, but I can't see this going anywhere but F. Sacred Flame is a classic cleric spell. Its two biggest perks are the fact that it deals radiant damage, which isn't commonly resisted, and that it ignores 1/2 and 3/4 cover. Given that the damage is described as descending, it does raise some questions about what if part of that cover is a roof. But then I guess from the perspective of the projectile, it has full cover. I don't know, it's a complicated one. Anyway, the biggest thing that's holding Sacred Flame back is that it's tied to a dexterity saving throw, which is probably about the worst save to target, and given that it's a cantrip, it's all or nothing. It's a very cool spell, and it's flavorful, but given that it's also only for one class, it introduces some complications and targets a dex save. I'm gonna put it into B tier. Shillelagh is an interesting spell that allows Druid to imbue their club or quarterstaff with some magical energy, allowing it to turn the damage type into force damage, but also then lets the Druid use their spellcasting ability modifier for the damage and attack rolls rather than strength. This is a cool concept that opens up some new melee options for the class. The biggest downsides are that the spell is only on the Druid list, and that it works on such a small selection of weapons, so it's going in B tier. Next up is Shocking Grasp, a spell that my gut says belongs in F, but I've bumped it slightly higher into C tier. Like its cousin Chill Touch, Shocking Grasp is another touch spell which is questionable for most spellcasters, like we already discussed. It also deals less damage than Chill Touch, sitting at 1d8. But what ultimately had me move it up into C tier was the fact that it negates opportunity attacks from the targeted creature. This can help you both deal damage and get away. It's essentially an attack with the disengage action glued to it. I'm not really ordering these within their respective tiers, but if I were, this would be at the bottom of C tier. Sorcerous Burst is another new and great spell. It has solid range of 120 feet and okay damage sitting at 1d8, but it has two other big upsides. Firstly, you get to select the damage type whenever you cast a spell, which means that you're probably never getting hit with a resistance. But it also has an exploding dice mechanic. If you roll an 8 on the damage die, you get to roll an extra d8 damage, stacking a total number of times equal to your spellcasting modifier. And yeah, this is totally one of those dream scenarios where you fantasize about hitting like 5 8s in a row, but obviously that's not going to happen. But hitting 1 is 12.5% chance, which actually isn't all that bad. The biggest thing holding the spell back is that it's only available to sorcerers. This is cleanly going in A tier. Spare the Dying is a very simple spell. It's a resource-free stabilization effect. Cast it on a dying target and they're stabilized. The interesting thing here is the range increases for the cantrip scaling, doubling at each level breakpoint. Now, by the time that you do get to scale it, you probably have enough spell slots to just spam something like Healing Word, but there is something very nice about just not needing to do that. I think that Spare the Dying has earned a spot in B tier as a very nice spell to have, and that's reliable in what it does. Moving on to another new spell, Starry Wisp. Combining a reasonable 60-foot range, a reliable damage type in the form of Radiance, a nice rider effect in preventing the targeted creature from benefiting from the invisible condition, Starry Wisp has all the makings of just a good all-around cantrip. It's A tier. Thaumaturgy is another spell in the same vein of spells like Elementalism and Prestidigitation. It does some cool things, but they probably aren't changing the game all that much. This one is often, though not always, relegated to the realm of threatening or intimidating or some display of power. It's a cool spell and does what it says. I think there's certainly an argument for it being in B tier, but I'm just going to put it in C. Call it a high C. Thorn Whip feels like a great idea and like a build-around spell, but it's just lacking in its execution. It's got poor damage, a commonly resisted damage type, low range, it's only on the Druid list, and a rider effect that is incredibly situational and only valuable to someone trying to make it work. It's going in F. Thunderclap is another spell that tries to persuade you with the dream of being surrounded by like 5 enemies and then just going off. The problem is that the damage it deals is pretty low, which is fine again if you're hitting multiple targets, but they all have to be within 5 feet. Thunder is a reasonable damage type, but it targets a Constitution save, which might be the only worse save to target than Dexterity. The spell tries to get you, and probably has worked like 6 times, but I just can't consider it reliable enough to justify picking. Oh, and it basically alerts anyone in the vicinity that you are there. This is F tier. Toll the Dead is great. Admittedly, the wisdom save isn't ideal, but the 60-foot range is alright, as is dealing necrotic damage. Beyond that though, is the fact that it deals 1d12 damage to any creature that isn't at full health, to which it would deal 1d8 necrotic damage. In reality, the vast majority of the time, this is dealing 1d12. It's available to clerics, wizards, and warlocks. This is just an A tier spell. True Strike has gone from being one of the most laughably bad spells in D&D to one that kind of enables a new archetype for spellcasters on its own. The spell doesn't deal any damage until you hit level 5, but what it does do is convert the damage type of any weapon that you use to Radiant, and allows you to use your spellcasting ability modifier for attack and damage rolls instead of strength or dexterity. And it's available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. This can greatly empower, or like I said, enable crossbow casters, for example, which can be pretty cool. I never thought I'd say these words, but I think I'm putting True Strike into A tier. Vicious Mockery is another classic spell that's hard not to love, especially if you have a player who's coming up with insults each time. The thing about Vicious Mockery though, is that it's a little bit more limiting than its 60-foot range might suggest. You need to be able to see or hear the target. Interestingly though, it doesn't actually need to be able to see or hear you. Anyway, this creates tons of scenarios where despite a creature being within 60 feet, the spell just might not work. Maybe it's just loud, or there's a barrier of some kind, or there's a silent spell active. The point is just that there's a lot of things that can unfortunately cause it to fail, and it only deals 1d6 damage. Now, the damage type is Psychic, which is very good and causes creatures to have disadvantage on its next attack roll, which is also excellent. In reality, this probably will go off most of the time, but the conditions are worth mentioning. I struggled with this one, but I think I'm gonna put it into B. And finally, we have Word of Radiance, which essentially suffers from all the same flaws as Thunderclap. The only upsides here are that it deals radiant damage, which is nice, and that it doesn't boom 100 feet of sound alerting everyone to your presence. I'm tempted to put it in F along with Thunderclap, but I think it's just marginally better, and clerics are more likely to be potentially in melee range, so it's easier to use for them. This, I'm going to put it into C tier. So that's my tier ranking of every cantrip in the 2024 Player's Handbook. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of disagreement with some of these picks, so please, I am curious what you have to say. Let me know in the comments. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.